Here we go. The title is Trollope, Millais, and Orley Farm. Many Trollope readers may be familiar with the apparent truth that Trollope strongly valued John Everett Millais' pictorial art in itself, was aroused imaginatively by at least some of Millais' many illustrations for his novels, and felt a warm regard for Millais as a man. The best known passage by Trollope about one of Millais' pictures occurs very late in Orley Farm. Sorrow in her heart and deep thought in her mind. While Lady Mason is imagined thinking about her coming ordeal as the accused on trial for perjury, Trollope tells us to turn back to an early depiction of her, chapter 5, placed well before we have begun to understand that the midnight scene, which haunts the novel and is imagined numerous times by more characters than Lady Mason, happened. In the dead of night, after her husband's adamant refusal to provide a gentleman's upbringing income for their baby son, with his corpse nearby, a household including said son asleep, Lady Mason forged 3 signatures to a made-up codicil for the will. Here she is presented as thinking about the accusation early in the book. Trollope writes, "In an early part of this story, I have endeavored to describe how this woman sat alone, with deep sorrow in her heart and deep thought on her mind, when she learned what terrible things were coming on her. The idea, however, which the reader will have conceived of her as she sat there will have come to him from the skill of the artist and not from the words of the writer. If that drawing is now near him, let him go back to it." I'm skipping lines. The lines of her face were now altered. The spirit expressed by it was changed. There was less of beauty, less of charm, less of softness. But in spite of all that she had gone through, there is more of strength, more of power to resist all that this world could do to her. During this talk, I'm going to differ with Trollope now and again. This particular picture cannot begin to give the depth of feeling his prose offers us in either chapter, nor the complicated, evolving verbal characterization of Lady Mason over many chapters in between. For example, when finally she confides her anger, tells her one woman friend, Mrs. Orme, of how she felt about her parents marrying her off to an old man, and how Rebecca-like enmity, continued deceit, and lack of active remorse, even now she would not yield. No single woodcut by Millais comes near these passages. In this first depiction, the whole effect, I think, is too consciously pretty. There's too much skirt once again, there to signal the class she now seemingly belongs to, an assumption of dignity. Closer to Trollope by this point in the novel is the more expressionist Lady Mason after her confession. Take a moment to observe what you're seeing again. If the kinds of pictures Millais most characteristically drew and painted, and was much praised for in the era, and since tell us anything, we begin to approach one of the strengths for which Millais was rightly valued. Millais is expressionistic. Through fiercely held moments of body stances or wreathing, he can convey upsurges of plangency that seem to derive from the soul within an agonized figure. Accurate realism is not what Millais was after. The room we see is improbably undecorated, with its bed and candles something like what you might expect to find in servants' quarters. The wide black, still graceful dress and shawl in which we glimpse 2 clutching hands are there to embody the total bereftness the figure is working to contain, the emotion she is controlling. There are numerous problems when we try to go back in time to value art objects our contemporary technologies have rendered, if not obsolete, woefully inadequate, or, if we can get ourselves to admit this, puzzling. None of the sets of illustrations for Trollope's novels can compete with the extant film adaptations we can stream into our computers at will. There's also the usual prejudice inherent in historical framing. Some sets of illustrations by relatively unknown artists for Trollope's novels are as frequently good as Millais, not just the half set by Hablot Brown, Fizz, whose mode for Can You Forgive Her, Trollope rejected as he seems to have rejected central elements of Dickens' art, now Burgo Fitzgerald. This is from Can You Forgive Her and is the frontispiece for my book, Trollope on the Net, because I thought it so perfectly captured, expressionistically, symbolically, unspoken aspects of Trollope's text, through animated and unsentimental lines and alert caricature, which prompts both pity for the beggar girl, turning away intensely to concentrate on that food and drink, and an awareness in the reader of how comfortable and leisured and unself-conscious is the insouciant elegantly dressed gentlemen. The artwork of Mary Ellen Edwards, The Claverings, Francis Arthur Fraser, The Golden Lion of Grandpere, Marcus Stone, He Knew He Was Right, George Houseman Thomas, Last Chronicle, and even Lionel G. Hawkes, The Way We Live Now, is often as good as Millais and wrongly simply dismissed or simply not reprinted. They also may seem to us to be as often inadequate. A third obstacle is the need for some knowledge of the aesthetics of the era. We need to know there are two distinctively different modes of illustration found in middle-class Victorian novels. Quite different from Millais, and most of the other illustrators Trollope agreed to, is the caricature, emblematic, and frequently fantastical style found in many of the era's novels. Dickens and Thackeray's novels are the most familiar places we have probably seen them, and they are far from inferior to the naturalistic Golden Age idyllic figure preferred by Trollope, can be more effective and what's more influence the naturalistic style. One uncompromising example of this character style will have to stand in for hundreds: Barnaby and Grip, his raven. This by Fizzigan of the mentally disabled Barnaby Rudge and his faithful friend the raven, to me captures more pity, respect, and understanding for the comradeship of an outcast pair than any of Dickens's words in the novel. Among Marcus Stone's generally strong-lined idyllic style illustrations for Trollope's He Knew He Was Right, Trevelyan at Casalunga approaches the nightmare quality of the fantastic style, but does not quite hit it, as he's constrained by notions of portraying the human body naturalistically. Let's look at that. A solitary man in the landscape won't do. Trevelyan's most unhinged projections of his sexual anxiety, perverse self-destructive wish fulfillment, his melancholy temperament are called for. The picture can serve to remind us that Trollope rarely, if ever, depicts his characters' dreams. One needs, therefore, to go outside Trollope's text to capture by visual means their inner life. As I said, the second basic mode of the era, often called idyllic picturesque, the word monumental is sometimes snuck in, is nonetheless Trollope's strong preference. I'd call it naturalistic, a term you can come across describing TV genres. Andrew Davies, the central creator for the TV serials for He Knew He Was Right and The Way We Live Now, uses the term. It can do transcendent work. Here is Francis Arthur Fraser, not for the first edition, but a later reprint of The Last Chronicle of Barset, dogged as does it. An interesting aspect of this one is the face of Crawley, that we see is the same we see in what to me is a rather dull depiction of the Crawley family by Millais in Framley Parsonage, but now grown so ravaged and rigid, the man's eyes stare glittering out at nowhere. I put it to everyone, this is another image of two people who have learned how to hold out, how to resist all that the world has done to them, and the punishment has been considerable. Notice how the working man holds the hand of the impoverished gentleman. As time went on, this style became darker, accommodated pictures of dire poverty and despair, and used very dark, smudgy shades, such as we find in Francis Montague Hull's series for Phineas Redux, Lady Laura at the Glass. Lady Laura's Kennedy's body and face show how the world's effects on her have ravaged her. It's not as dark as the more typical illustrations of this later manifestation of the idyllic style, say Lucas Field's series for Dickens for The Mystery of Edwin Drood, no such as we find in Trollope and Fawkes's illustrations of The Way We Live Now, two of which were copied at the 2004 film adaptation. Especially good they are for prison and street scenes and also railway stations. Lady Laura at her glass combines the nightmare fantasies of the emblematic with the monumental feel of idyllic types. What we don't want to do is judge such pictures by literal accuracy. Why not? Because you get involved with the kinds of arguments still written about Millais' illustrations to Trollope's novels. An admittedly excellent essay by Michael Mason overwhelms you with proof that beyond a doubt, Millais either got many details in Trollope wrong or didn't bother to look carefully at what Trollope described. There are half-refutations by, among other, Hilary Guesty and Eliana Marin, both of whom assert it doesn't matter and then go on to try to show where Millais did pay attention. David Skilton argues these kinds of arguments misunderstand how to read Victorian book illustrations. You must look at the interactions between the whole series for the book and the whole text. There is today a prejudice against book illustrations in books for adult readers. Henry James was among the first novelists to inveigh vehemently against somebody else's pictures getting between him and his text. It's true especially in the area of film adaptation. The difference between the way any individual reader has imagined the characters in a book and the way a filmmaker team realizes them often offers many irritated fans an easy and understandable form of literal attack. And dismaying book illustrations may be disruptive. Since they're rarely considered necessary or quite the adult thing to do, not much money is usually spent on this. But that a thing is badly done is no argument against it. In Trollope's time, publishers hired the best artists to draw for them and demanded engravers who were skilled craftsmen because this increased the sales of their book. Lastly, readers in Trollope's eras are thought to have understood the art of stopping reading to dwell on a juxtaposed picture, to see how the picture also tells the story, how it may emphasize a different aspect of the story or transcend the story altogether. Personal taste comes into what we like to dwell on, as well as our own interpretation of the text, but some objectivity is possible. For my chapter in my book on Trollope called The Original Illustrations to Trollope's Novels, I viewed over 400 of the original illustration, including the vignettes and large letters at chapter openings. This can be done if you live in the United States, as I do, near the Library of Congress, which is a deposit library. And throughout Trollope's era, acquired copies of British periodicals where most of the illustrations for Trollope's novels may be found. A telling count. I found only four depictions of hunting in all the original illustrations to Trollope's novels. The one of Monkton Grange and Orley Farm is one of these. The reason readers today think these predominate is these four are frequently reprinted. The publishers thinking this is what readers of Trollope expect, and so they reinforce a mistaken impression. People politicking and engaging in economic activity are found in Ralph the Heir and The Way We Live Now, but otherwise such scenes are uncommon. I estimate less than 1/3 of the pictures, including vignettes, which are often mood pieces, are comic. What Trollope seems to have wanted, for he did get to suggest what scenes to portray, are depictions of deep feeling, absorbed moments of emotional intensity, figured within a social scene or when alone, often right after a crisis is over. The private self is suddenly seen. There are a few of these in Orley Farm, like Van Bower's Dream, but nowhere enough and not all equally successful. Critics often say that Millais' illustrations for other books than Trollope show him at his true best. Here is another single one in place of many, from Millais' illustration of an 1864 book called The Parables of Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, The Good Samaritan. I think it's just stunning and typical of him. Notice the donkey, though. It's one Trollopean touch among many Trollopean touches found in Millais' work outside Trollope. Many of these have the most minimal of text and details. So out of 40 full-page illustrations for Orley Farm, 17 are of events and or characters directly involved in just the Orley Farm case. That's 42.5%, says Google. They capture crucial and nuanced moments across Lady Mason's story. Two are frontispieces. The first, Millais' depiction of Orley Farm, the deep heart's core of the book, as Professor O'Gorman has told us, which N. John Hall in his Trollope Illustrated demonstrates is a close replication of a photo taken for the occasion. Let's look at that. Why is that dairy milkmaid milking a cow at the bottom of the meadow? People have found other oddities in this one. It's not true Pre-Raphaelite art is even mostly paintings of strongly melodramatic medieval or early Renaissance looking large figures. At least half their paintings are of landscapes, animals and plants, houses, sky, birds, and weather usually caught only by a camera. The use of the camera was Ruskin's idea and strongly influential on Millais and the Pre-Raphaelites. This is the kind of detail in Millais hard to show in Orley Farm, the Orley Farm set, because it lacks the vignettes and letters, which, however, are found in the small house at Allington. So here are two of these to show you that Millais vignettes not infrequently defy taboos, show things not permitted in words in Victorian novels. That's the small house of Allington. Anyone who has read The Small House will instantly connect this bull with his penis or balls in about the middle of the picture with Johnny Eames and the squire. We don't need any more words. Don't miss the leg turned upwards to the side. The letter is T. Let's look at another one. Others are hard to connect clearly with something specific, like this of traveling boxes. It's also from The Small House, a vignette which occurs just after Adolphus Crosby, in a deeply embittered mood, writes his letter of rejection to Lily Dale. Somber in mood, we see some books, a tall wooden box, a lined, aged truck. Perhaps my fellow readers are beginning to realize who do not consider Orley Farm to contain Trollope's best series by Millais. I offer the idea instead it contains a few that are transcendent, and they reinforce a sympathetic view of Lady Mason, a way of reading her case that either Millais or Trollope or both were quietly urging on the reader. The intensely active Christmas at Noningsby, where we see a very chubby man playing blind man's bluff with a group of children, is one disconnected, transcendent picture we shouldn't ignore. Note how the diagonal lines crisscrossing the figure make this sense of crowded action and movement. In the last part of my talk, I'm calling attention to pictures in the Orley Farm series that are not among those admired, but have been curiously and revealingly often reprinted with puzzled remarks. In a number of Trollope's novels, what happens is the illustrations emphasize a sub-story of a tertiary character. One example is Edith Brownlow in The Vicar of Bullhampton. The illustrator is Henry Woods, whom Hall dismisses as just beneath contempt. So I want to look at one such in Orley Farm, which has puzzled readers, Mr. Aram and Mr. Chaffanbrass. First, who is who? Critics staring at this have suggested the figure we see best does not square with Trollope's several descriptions of Chaffanbrass. Neither fit the bill for a dirty little man without his gown and wig, and then Trollope always suggests insignificant. What some might call a Jewish nose is seen prominently on the man nearly facing us. There is a picture on the wall with a woman with a kind of veil one might associate with crossing the desert, a place associated with Jewish people. The image dropped into the book faces a dialogue between Chaffanbrass and Aram, where they're discussing who should cross-examine whom. Mr. Aram is objecting to having egoism and any of the staff direct any choices. In such a case as we have here, says Mr. Aram, I detest all etiquette and precedent, and I'm not going to have my client overthrown. I call attention also to the non-depiction of British Bolster herself, but rather the phalanx of high-ranking males she has to face during her testimony. Let's look at Bridget Bolster facing the court. Stop and imagine the courage of this female servant with all these male eyes upon her. In the event, Furnival browbeats and confuses the nervous Kenneby, and then Chaffanbrass, realizing the method by which Bridget Bolster has decided she cannot be confused, simply repeating over and over, I did one and I didn't do no more, resorts to insulting, insinuating remarks about her personal life, motives for turning up once again, and implies this sentence is memorized, practiced, a paid feint. Can we go back to Mr. Aram and Mr. Chaffanbrass? What is Mr. Aram's role in the proceedings, besides insisting on status must not be considered in choosing who examines whom? We're told he visits Orley Farm more than once, and the night before the trial begins, it is he who settles it that the way to and from the court will be by hired closed carriage, Mrs. Orme and Lady Mason inside, and himself seated on the box on top. Each day, Mr. Aram turns up to Lady Mason and Mrs. Orme and the two sons with, quote, suddenly little instructions in a low voice as to the manner in which they should go home and return the next morning, and how he will be there to meet them at the door of the court. He is once suddenly there, reminding Felix Graham what he has been hired to do. It is he who has gained knowledge of who lived in Hampton when the jury is chosen, so he's central in which people are passed over. Mr. Aram turns up after Furnival's concluding peroration to suggest to Mrs. Orme not to tell Lady Mason to be sure of acquittal. And when he lifts his hat to leave Mrs. Orme, insinuates it's important Lucius Mason not be there when the verdict is delivered. Thus is Mrs. Orme driven to make Lucius understand his mother forged the signatures. And that last morning, Mr. Aram, as ever so self-effacingly, says to Mrs. Orme he is relieved because by coming up to this day, Lucius has done all the good he could do. No wonder Trollope wanted to have him included in the pictures. The scene where Lady Mason is driven to tell Sir Peregrine she is guilty of all this with which they charge me has been much admired. And Trollope himself says of his own scene, it is as good and sensational as several highly memorable scenes in two novels by Walter Scott, Jane Eyre and Henry Esmond. Let's look at Guilty. It's painful to me to look at the picture of Lady Mason cringing at the feet of Sir Peregrine Orme. It makes me cringe. Who is he that she should cringe to him? But look carefully, and you also see that in winding her arms around his knees and lower legs, she is seeking to shield her body by his, as if he were a bulwark. His hand is up in a perhaps feeble gesture to push away reality, or is he absolving her? His fist is against his chest. We may feel for him as an old man, but far from protecting her, he comes close to giving her away. In his visit to the other side's lawyer, Mr. Round, an important scene to which is devoted a very poor illustration, which I shall spare you. You can look at it online. I suggested in my talk on Dr. Thorne that Trollope's seventh novel is radical because it makes an apparently penniless bastard the heroine of the book, whose unexpected huge inheritance shows up the untrustworthy hypocrisy of the established order, and because it substitutes another criteria for rank and money as a basis for life, affectionate human bonds made legitimate by time and effort. I see this story of Lady Mason as taking this radical stance from a vulnerable, non-status woman's point of view much further. I realize the way people talk about this central story is to emphasize the exposure Trollope makes of legal procedures. Courts are not places where a key aim is to ferret out truth. In this novel, like Trollope's others with trial scenes, we see adversarial fights where lawyers use unfair exploitative means, where subjective impressions and feelings about the people involved on the parts of the judge, jury, and lawyers play a strong role, all to produce a verdict the community is expected to respect and everyone in the novels minimally accept. Not everyone does. I'm taking a very different angle on what these lawyers end up with, one which I suggest the novel and Millais' pictures also sustain. I say that Lady Mason's team achieved the morally right verdict. Her son has failed her, but they did not. Lady Mason does not go to jail, as she should not. What the pictures do is reinforce what the dramatized events of the book show. To keep herself safe for all these years and to continue to live in some kind of peace, she has performed obeying other people's wills and has lived apart. Only this way can she remain strong. She's been careful to consult others at each step, like what school to send Lucius to. Trollope suggested in the event that advice was bad. Lucius needed to go to one of the usual well-known upper-class young gentlemen's schools where he could have been knocked about. It has produced a son who fails to understand all she has given up for him. She will continue to remain for the rest of her life alone. Again, a lack of time constrains me to show one picture in lieu of the 4 more with Lady Mason in them that I've not yet shown. So it's been a life of masking, of semi-cringing, as we are shown in this early semi-fearful presentation of Lady Mason by herself. Your son Lucius did say, shopping? How tentatively Lady Mason stands there, as if reluctant to take up any space. There's a look of hesitancy on her face and in her hand. This one has on the floor a stack of papers with a ribbon round them. They might symbolize or remind us of the documents Lady Mason forged, which she has been not allowed to and not been able to forget. And now she must give up the one near friend worthy of her that she has made. Last one, farewell. This is the novel's penultimate image. As common with Millais, it's a central square or rectangle with a triangular intersection of bodies. The expressionistic dresses outline a height of intense grief contained. I use great tints in reproducing the image so you could see it clearly. Perhaps it's meant to be an evanescent blackness. There's a book on the table. Like Fizz's Barnaby and Grip, there is no specific equivalent in Trollope's text. The last we hear of Lady Mason, her son has gone far, far away, Australia. And I quote Trollope, Mrs. Orme, though, kept her promise and wrote constantly to Lady Mason, hearing from her as constantly. Lady Mason is both punished and rewarded. End of talk.